Let us please give a warm FCCBC welcome to Reverend William Wyne.
Well, good morning. I have been going to the Presbyterian Church for the last couple of years, and I told them from the very beginning, listen, guys, I'm either Baptist or congregational. I don't work with a Presbyterian church, so they fired me, and so I'm back at the congregational church. So I'm grateful to be here. And once again, I am very appreciative of the relationship that I have with this church, as well as members of my own congregation. I have relationships with persons in this church. Every Monday when I come into the office, when I do, I find some people from the congregational church meeting with members of my church in a book club, and how warm that makes me feel. But I'm very grateful for the relationship I have with this church, and of course, the respect I have for your senior pastor, Pastor Thomas Ott. I'm appreciative of that. And as Reverend Reinberg said, I have a good relationship with Tom Reinberg. Now, it's debatable about my relationship with Emily Joy. But I think that this church has, in my opinion, three of the finest ministers that I've met in all my life. And they are so gifted and so talented at what they do. And I appreciate them more than they know, and I'm more appreciative of the various gifts that God has given them, especially these two, at what they do. It's just a real joy to know them and watch them work. That's why I join that young people, because anytime somebody says young people come, I'm just not buying into where I am now. I just get up and hang out with the young folks, because it just makes me feel young to do that. So I'm very grateful for that. Appreciate the Ministry of Music for this choir today. Really appreciate that so much. Amen. Amen. Well, you know, this idea of preaching about Jonah came out of your own pastor's thoughts. I knew I was in trouble when I allowed Tom Ott to decide what we were going to preach. And so this morning I want to talk to you about this idea about a whale of a circumstance. A whale of a circumstance. So we're brought to this Old Testament story about Jonah and a whale. And historically, all of our denominations and our theologies have oftentimes placed more emphasis on the whale that Jonah was in. And of course, the story is that Jonah is attempting to get away from where God and what God has called him to do. Jonah is actually violating the contract of covenant that he apparently made to be obedient to what God has said. And in his attempt to get away from the contractual covenant of being caring and loving, he runs away on a ship. And while on the ship, a storm comes and he is cast over from the ship. And there in the sea awaits for him a great fish, a whale. The whale, in many ways, has become the dominant theme of the Jonah story. But can you imagine this? Jonah, the prophet of God, the one who has the badge of holiness and redemption, the one who supposedly represents the tenets of truth and faith and compassion, is being disobedient. And he ends up in the belly of a whale. But I want to suggest to you that the whale that Jonah was in was not as great as the whale that was in Jonah. Now, right there at my church would have said, amen. They would have said that too. Dr. Howard Thurman, who was the dean of Howard University and the first African American who was the dean of Boston College and went on to have really the first multicultural church in Boston and California, said, if the darkness in you, or if the light in you is greater than the darkness outside of you, then is that light in you the true light of Jesus Christ? If the light in you can be conquered by the darkness outside of you, then is that light the real light? In his book, he says that one of the problems with most of our churches, in his book, and Jesus and the Disinherited, he said that most of our churches have become too sterile and too stoic. And in the book, Jesus and the Disenfranchised, he says that Jesus reminded the world that he partnered with the pain and the oppression and the suffering of everybody. That he says that Jesus tried to teach us that it is difficult to be in this business and isolate yourself from the common experience of the common man. And Jesus partnered with people who were oppressed, suffering, and disenfranchised. You got to remember, as Dr. Benjamin Mays said at Morehouse, he said, you know, Jesus really did not get into trouble because of his faith in God. He ultimately got in trouble because of his belief in mankind. In other words, Jesus got in trouble because he talked to women openly. He got in trouble because he literally cared about the lepers. He got in trouble because he had the mitigating gall to sit down with publicans and sinners. He got in trouble because he healed the sick. He tried to do something about what he saw. And Jesus says, and Thurman says, that the church gets in trouble when it tries to actually do something about what they ought to do. You know, I say to my congregation all the time, the world and Satan doesn't care about you coming to church on Sunday. It gets disturbed when you begin to believe it and do what you ought to do. Nobody gets disturbed about you coming to worship and singing these wonderful songs and praying these prayers, but the world and the evil influence gets upset when you actually believe that you can do something about it. Thurman says that Jesus got into trouble because he believed he could do something about it. Jonah could have benefited from that theology had Jonah thought about that God really expects me to do something about what I see. Here is what Jonah's problem was. Jonah was living, in my opinion, in a form of religious contradiction and hypocrisy. His contradiction and his hypocrisy was revealed in the mere fact of how he treated others. That was his contradiction. That was his hypocrisy. How he treated others and how he saw others. You see, Jonah was comfortable as long as he could masquerade around in his prophetical cloak, looking very religious, acting very faithful, going along doing his little wonderful prophetical duty. He was comfortable as long as he could operate in his comfort zone. But then God says to Jonah, hey, go to Nineveh. And Jonah says, are you serious? Really, God? Jonah was uncomfortable going to Nineveh because they didn't look like him in Nineveh. They didn't sound like him in Nineveh. They didn't have the same experiences in life that he had. Nineveh was a place that he was uncomfortable with. And I'll agree with you that sometimes God challenges us to go to places where we're not comfortable. But then God says to us, if you go to places where you are uncomfortable, I will help you be comfortable. That was Jonah's problem. Jonah says, in essence, I wouldn't mind going to Nineveh, but I don't like the way they look. I don't like their experiences. And his commission was to go to that city where there were those who were different from him. And Jonah said, Lord, rather than to go, I'd rather be resistant. Here is what Jonah, I think, was saying. Jonah was saying, here is my position. Number one, these people don't deserve to experience forgiveness, grace, favor, mercy, and justice. And if they do deserve it, they don't deserve as much of it as I have. And if you're going to give it to them, I don't want to be the conduit that gives it to them. That's Jonah's theology. If you're going to give it to them, I don't want it to come through me. Dr. Benjamin Mays says it so well. He says, it's amazing. We have mastered the air. We've conquered the sea. We've annihilated distance. We've prolonged life, but we are not wise enough and lack enough authentic love to live on the earth and be one with each other. We can master the air, conquer the sea, annihilate distance, prolong life, and yet can't figure out how to be authentically concerned by one another on earth. That was the whale in Jonah. He could not get beyond his own history. The Syrians had been tough on Israel. They had oppressed them. They had caused Israel to be enslaved. They were wrong. But God somehow or another apparently looked at Assyria, and God says, I'm willing to forgive them. And he asked Jonah, Jonah, go to Nineveh and proclaim the good news that I've given you. And Jonah says, no, not going, because they don't deserve that good news. But what Jonah was really saying was the pain of his past kept him from moving forward. And Jonah needed to know that the past ought to not be a hitching post, but the past ought to be a guidepost. And Jonah would not let the pain of his past get beyond the present and the future. Churches can be like that. Churches can hitch on to the past without realizing that the past ought not be a hitching post, but a guidepost. That was the pain in Jonah. That was Jonah's problem. That was his well. He could not get beyond his own history. He could not have a possibility for people in the present because he was locked down by the past. That was the whale in Jonah. And the second whale in Jonah was he could not see others beyond his own eyes. See, when Jonah looked at the Assyrians, he looked at the Assyrians as his enemies. He saw Nineveh as a foreign place, but when God looked at the Assyrians, he saw them as a people and a place who needed to experience the love of God. And God said, I need someone who has experienced the love of God to go to Nineveh and demonstrate them what the love of God looks like. You know what God was saying to Jonah? God was saying, Jonah, get up off of your righteous intentions and do something. Jonah, get involved. Get involved. Get connected. I think our greatest challenge is to look at persons with the eyes of God. That does not mean that you don't see people for who they really are, but you see people for what they can be. I had a colleague, and I think he was trying to be nice, who said to me on one occasion, I don't see you as an African-American male preacher. I said, really? Well, you don't see me as a Jewish preacher, do you? I want you to see me for who I am, but not see me for who I am on the outside. See me for who I can be on the inside. See me for whom God made me, and that is a creature who wants to experience the love of God. I see people for who they really are, but I refuse to allow the history of my past to keep me from seeing people for the present and the future. You know, I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. If I allowed my past to dominate my present, I promise you I wouldn't be standing up in here preaching to you. I heard the 16th Street church blow up. My band director was the father of Carol Robinson, who was killed in the 16th Street bombing. I saw Shuttlesworth house bomb. I refused to be handcuffed by the pain of my past. I see people for who they are in God. And that was Jonah's problem. Jonah couldn't get beyond pigmentation. He couldn't get beyond culture. He couldn't get beyond the fact that the Nineveh were creatures that God had made. And so we have to understand that those persons who may not look like us and those persons who may not have the same experience, they deserve more than the crumbs of life. They deserve the loaf as well. They deserve to be treated like everybody else. It's difficult sometimes to really get out of the whale of your circumstance when there is a whale of circumstances in you. And you know that you have a whale of a circumstance in you if you are comfortable and happy with life and community staying the same. You know, and I know that I would have a whale of a circumstance in me if I was just satisfied with my little lot in life. And community and churches and life just staying the same. Because I think God calls us to do something radical. Something different. Something that means something to others. And that's Jonah's problem. The whale in Jonah was, he was too busy judging them and not looking at his own life. And that's so important, that as we talk about the whale of circumstances that we're in, we have to make sure that we have gotten rid of the circumstances that are large in us. Getting beyond our history, seeing others with the eyes of God and not our eyes, and then not judging others before we judge ourselves. Jonah gets angry at God because God allows a bush to die. And God says, Jonah, you mean to tell me you care more about a bush than people? Jonah, you care more about the trivial death of a bush when there are people over in Nineveh that needs a word of life and you have it. That was a young boy who was very zealous, and he worked real hard at demonstrating hard work. So he walked into this pharmacy, and this was before cell phones, and he got a cord out of his pocket, made a phone call. The pharmacist happened to be at the desk, and he could overhear the call. The young boy called, and the person on the end picked up, a woman, and the young man said, "Good afternoon, ma'am. I was just calling to see whether or not you needed any lawn service. I'm going through the community and I'm taking care of everyone's lawn, and I want to know if you need lawn service." And apparently the woman said to him she already had a lawn boy who would take care of her lawn. And the pharmacist could only hear the responses from the boy, so he could get a sense of what she was saying. And apparently she said to him, "I already have someone." And he said, "Well, since you have someone, ma'am, is he doing a good job?" And apparently she says, "Yes." Then the young boy said to her, "When he gets through, does he sweep up and get all of the grass off the driveway?" And apparently she says, "Yes." And then he said, "Well, does he come every week just like he said he would and on time?" Apparently she says, "Yes." "Do you think he's doing a good job?" And apparently she says, "Yes." He said, "Okay, ma'am, I really thank you for giving me the information and talking to me, and I hope everything works out for you." He hung the phone up, and the pharmacist is standing there listening. He says, "I need to encourage him. He's calling, and he's trying to get a job, and apparently the woman has somebody. I need to encourage him." He says, "Young man," he said, "excuse me, I'm not trying to get in on your conversation, but I heard the conversation, and I want to just tell you, don't be discouraged. Keep on trying to get a job. I'm sorry you didn't get that lawn job." He said, "Excuse me, sir?" He says, "Well, I'm sorry that you didn't get." He says, "No, sir, I'm sorry." He says, "I am her lawn boy. I was just calling to check up on myself." I think the greatest test that we have in all of our churches, instead of being judgmental of our theologies and our denomination, why don't we do a self-check on, are we being what God wants us to be? I want to challenge you to check the whale of the circumstance in you. And every once in a while, be like that lawn boy in our churches. Check up on yourself and see whether or not we are loving the unlovable. We are compassionate about those who are experiencing life discomfort. We are looking at people not through the eyes of our pain or history, but we are looking at people through the eyes of God. Do your own self-check, and I think God will be glorified. Amen.